I'm finding myself a little bit sidelined. I'm normally a real walker and talker, but this time I now have to go back every time that I want to. I'm waiting for this to start. Oh, and it started. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me on day X of ETHDenver, well, I guess day one of the main event. Next to, for those of you that are not here and watching from online, next to an orchestra, which is about 30, 40 meters away. So if you hear ambient music, I promise you that's where it's coming from. I didn't choose this. So the topic of this talk is making Wildcats great again. So, question for the audience. Raise your hand if you know what a Wildcat was. The fact that a bunch of you are not raising your hand is really disappointing, given I've spoken about it for 3 years. But Wildcat banks were a feature of westbound expansion in the States in the 1800s. They were individual banks that were set up effectively in the middle of nowhere, and they took in deposits and they issued their own scrip notes. They were called Wildcats because people either, I think the prevailing theory goes that a lot of the notes had Wildcats on them, or because they were so in the middle of nowhere that Wildcats were the only things that you could see. So the way it worked was obviously, this was the 1800s, so you had to kind of go in and be like, I'd like to redeem my stuff, please show me your backing collateral. And there are a couple of famous cases where you would, you'd get like a chest of the money that was backing the coins, and you'd peel back a layer of coins, and they would just be like iron screws. So they eventually, they proliferated really hard, and then ultimately collapsed. The way it's told by Elizabeth Warren and co., who uses Wildcat as a slur, is that they effectively were such a disaster that they necessitated the creation of the Federal Reserve and the banking system, which we all love today. Now, I've just gone over these slides already, but they relied on you knowing that they existed, like everything did in the 1800s, and they also relied on the fact that they were in the middle of nowhere, so it was actually quite difficult to cash your scrip in. So you would end up having to trade those not tokens. I'm skipping ahead slightly. You would have to trade your Wildcat notes for whatever people reckon they were worth for in whatever bumfuck town that you were in. Now, it turns out that we are actually, in the year of our Lord 2025, slightly better positioned to inspect the details of what's backing things, and we don't need to go to a location because we can just sit there on our RPC. So I think there's been a little bit of historical revisionism about Wildcats in the last 10, 15 years, especially by people from Peter Selgin, who really, really big on kind of open banking again. But yeah, the reality is they did expand the monetary supply. They did provide credit, even though it was dangerously edged credit, because you didn't necessarily know if it, how well it was backed, but you had that option there available to you. And given that at the time, most of what people were doing were trading furs and what have you, it did give you an option to do some kind of financial engineering. So, I am hating the fact that I have to go back here to click next. I should have brought my own clicker. Apologies, everyone. So, we've all been here for long enough. God knows we are trapped in an unending cycle of down only. But it was worse 3 years ago. As you all remember, we all collectively loaned something like $55 billion through platforms such as Genesis, BlockFi, Celsius, and so on last time, because ZERP was a phenomenon that was happening, and 8% on your USDC was an amazing deal. But we didn't know where anything was. We didn't know who was receiving it. We didn't know on what terms. It was all completely opaque. I would argue that we can do better this time, and we should. Just because these platforms collapsed isn't necessarily, although tied, as an indictment on their business model. However, it needs more eyes. It really, really does. It needs people to be able to see and inspect and autistically write 30 tweet threads on what's happening to what borrower on what terms. I hope you watch this eventually, Adam. So, I do believe that I work as an advisor to Euler. One of my first big DeFi nerd snipes was Aave. I love over-collateralized lending, being able to effectively Lombard loan assets one for the other with LTVs. I think it's amazing. It's one of the things that really excited me about crypto. But if you don't have that capital to start, it makes expansion incredibly difficult. And currently, there are a couple of brokers that exist, such as Hidden Road, Falcon X. There are a couple of protocols as well, which still all do secured lending now. But there are not many mechanisms to enable or support under-collateralized credit that is recorded and visible on-chain today. I think it's probably a little bit trite to say the phrase borrow against your future, but that's effectively what the VC model is, right? Well, you're not borrowing it, you're giving it to people, but we need a mechanism to do that. I've thought about this for years. Before I started in crypto, I worked at a startup that did AI ML modeling on like individuals, how much you could borrow in a community. You know, this was back in a time before saying all of those words together got you 50 million in a pre-seed investment from like slavering VCs. But it does require thinking a little bit different to how we do things now. In crypto, we very much say, you know, trust but verify. Not your keys, not your coin, etc. The default thinking here is that debt is over-collateralized by default. This is why we always talk about the concept of bad debt. I think there was something that happened very recently on Venus with ZK Sync. I think that was like in the last couple of days, if not hours, if I've not got that wrong. But it does require that the point of a ledger is to inspect things publicly. What better purpose then to use it to record actual debt? It means that we should at least try and introduce a mechanism for true under-collateralized lending on Ethereum. And that means bringing Wildcats back. I think we know where I'm going with all of this, especially if you've seen Twitter in the last 2 hours or so. Your favorite twatters do agree. This has been a long beating drum that it is a thing that we need to introduce as a primitive again. I'm not sure. For context, Wasi Lawyers, the rest of it does suggest that I borrow $1 billion and then flee a country, I think. So that's why that one's cropped. But the general gist is there. Credit is a growth engine for every economy, and DeFi is our attempt at creating one of our own. We need credit expansion. So, I'm not much of a believer in telling people what to do, unless they're in my group chats. I don't think a neutral facilitation layer should decide anything about what a deal should look like. This is also because I've been corrupted by contract law, and I think that freedom of contract is pretty important. If you decide that you want to borrow $100 million worth of Milady tokens at 30% APR, that should be on you. There should be a mechanism to allow for that. I also believe that you should not necessarily be pooling debt to go to multiple people, because then you have contagion. We saw this happening on a couple of protocols in the past. One would collapse and it would effectively haircut everyone. You should also be able to trade that debt. If you go, actually, I'm lending to Laurence and he looks like a shite deal now, but I do think that someone should be able to collect this in court, I should be able to sell that debt on tokenized. Again, true borrower-lender agreements are often very different to what an underwriter will decide they are. And I think there should be a mechanism to allow for that. But the problem is always that you need someone will always say what could go wrong with underwriting or handling defaults. 3Jane's a really good thing that if you're American, I really recommend looking at 3Jane. They partner with collection agencies. In the US, they ask you to use Plaid to tie things like your bank account details and so on and so forth. They partner with agencies that will break your kneecaps if you default. Maybe don't do that. But it is very much an American tool right now. Andre Cronier has just released Block Bureau. Some people think this is a very dark path. I think it rocks. Grabbing a bunch of hundreds of millions of transactions and getting a model for what does your behavior on chain look like in terms of your ability to repay. I think it's useful, but these are all focusing on individuals who want things like mortgages or short-term 5-figure loans. So when it comes to underwriting, I also believe that it should be very much caveat emptor. You should be able to facilitate those things by doing your own due diligence. If a borrower does not want to tell you the details or kind of where they're based or what their financials look like, you shouldn't lend to them. That's pretty simple. So The other part is, and I think this angers a lot of crypto lawyers, when people default, we saw this with Three Arrows Capital, may they rot in hell, they're like, things like Kleros don't cut it. This kind of like kumbaya notion of on-chain mechanisms for resolving courts just doesn't work when it's millions and millions of dollars that have been alamaded into the void. So, but we do have Ethereum tech. So you can say, here is text that creates a legally binding contract, and you can just sign that with ETHDenver. It turns out there are not many countries in the world that don't permit that as a legally binding signature. But with that said, yeah, if someone comes to you and says, oh yeah, hey, I'd like to borrow, like I'm some arbitrary market maker based out of, I don't know, Slovenia, not that I have any problem with Slovenians, and I want to borrow at 7%, probably not that much over the, the overnight rate in the States, and they'd be like, well, no, you should actually reflect that a bit higher with what you're offering. And if they don't, you shouldn't lend to them. So, again, if you saw Twitter, we built this and we released it 2 hours ago with the Wildcat protocol, a new version that has been the bane of my development life for the last year. The fact that I have not killed myself publicly is testament to how much I want this to happen. What we've changed, very much en vogue. Everyone talks about hooks for everything, Uni v4, every type of new versions of Balancer, pre- and post-transaction hooks that gate logic. You can now have fixed duration markets. You can now have things like, minimum deposits. If you want to, ZK proofs are a really important part of where I think this is going. ZK tech is finally commercial grade. And if you want to be able to say, I am only willing to borrow from someone that has sent me the DNA of their dad, we now have the ability to do that. Even if it's something much lighter, like I just want to check on chain through Chainalysis that they're not OFAC sanctioned, that's possible. That's light work. That's one function call. But you can pass things along like, oh, we've hashed a passport and that matches what's on your Kraken account. Amazing. I do believe that you should be able to borrow what works for you and lend to who you trust. I've not been following much of the slides, but I think that's important. It's live now. Evgeny is not going to thank me for doing this, but Wintermute have been using this in a very hamstrung version for V1. It's not stopped them from doing something like 77 million, and no one hates Wintermute for doing it more than they do for everything else for charts. We've been onboarding a bunch of people over the last couple of weeks. And it's surprising because people go, if you're a huge market maker, why would you need to borrow under collateralized? Or why would you need to ask the retail market? And the answer is, if you believe that you're able to effectively use that capital and things like brokers are capping you at a certain limit, why would you not try? I will confess, I considered speaking to Bybit the other day, in the aftermath of the hack, and it's like, we could probably try and spin you up something really quickly. But then they got their bridge loans really quickly from BitGet, so good on them. That's private credit. That was no collateral, no interest rate, give it back when you're ready. And I want that kind of stuff to be available on-chain for everyone. Thank you very much. I don't know if I have time for questions. Oh no, I have 50 seconds. I might just stand here and sing. I'm not singing.